12 hours after the death of President Umaru Musa Yar'Adua, his vice, Goodluck Ebele Jonathan, was sworn in as the new president and commander-in-chief of the Armed Forces of Nigeria. It was the first time a vice president would succeed to the presidency due to the death of his boss. Before becoming the country's #1 citizen, the new president had never before been elected to a public office by his own doing, but had somewhat always found himself in power after his principal has bowed out either through corruption charges or through death. In 2011, Jonathan would contest for a full term and win. He went on to rule in his own right for the next 4 years until his defeat in 2015. Goodluck Jonathan's political career began in 1998 when Dieprie Alamesiya, who was running for the governorship position in Bayelsa State on the platform of the People's Democratic Party, invited him to join his campaign team. Jonathan later said he had joined Alamesiya's campaign team to familiarize himself with the people in government. Alamesiya then chose him to be his running mate. Their party won the elections and Goodluck Jonathan became the deputy governor of Bayelsa State. They were sworn into office on May 29, 1999 and re-elected 4 years later in 2003. Jonathan ran a low profile and was fairly unknown as a deputy governor and was only heard of when he became the governor of Bayelsa State following the arrest of Alamesiya. Alamesiya was on a trip to the United Kingdom for a health procedure when he was arrested and charged with money laundering. He was then impeached by the Bayelsa State Assembly. Jonathan was reluctant to take over as governor, but was compelled by the presidency to fill his superior's shoes and was sworn in on December 9, 2005 as the new governor of Bayelsa State. He served the state for 18 months and remained loyal to the Alamesiya family. However, a blight on his tenure as governor was when in September 2006, officials of the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission (EFCC) seized $13.5 million from his wife, Patience Jonathan, at an airport. The Anti-Graft Commission ended up not reporting findings of their investigation on the source of the money to this day, and Jonathan was also not publicly charged, even though his name was on EFCC's list of corrupt governors. Notwithstanding, during the 2007 elections, Jonathan was picked as Umaru Yar'Adua's running mate by outgoing President Olusegun Obasanjo and his subsequent move to the center of power. While promoting Umaru Musa Yar'Adua as the PDP candidate for the 2007 elections, former President Olusegun Obasanjo chose Jonathan as Yar'Adua's running mate, not just because he was from the southern part of the country, but also because, according to him, Jonathan was loyal and honest. Obasanjo said this against the backdrop of how Jonathan reacted when his boss, Alamesiya, was arrested. He was not hungry or desperate to take over, but was humble and still loyal to the governor. Obasanjo also chose him to somehow pacify Niger Deltans who had been agitating for better representation and development in the region, and also find a lasting solution to the ongoing conflict by militants. Just like his usual self, Jonathan had at first been reluctant to become the vice president as he was content being the governor of his state, but later succumbed. His acceptance displaced former governor of Rivers State, Dr. Peter Odili, who was deemed the party's choice of a vice president, but was rejected by Yar'Adua. Though his appointment earned him political enemies, Jonathan was a source of pride to the Ijaw nation and received their support. However, his campaign office, the Bayelsa government house, and even his family home were all attacked by perceived enemies who were against his emergence as the vice presidential candidate of the PDP. Jonathan was seen as an administrator and not a leader, but against all odds, he came out unscathed and went on to win the elections with Yar'Adua. On November 23, 2009, President Yar'Adua traveled to Saudi Arabia for medical treatment of pericarditis, but he did not officially hand over to his vice before leaving. A vacuum was created, and the country was somewhat on the brink of a constitutional crisis. As expected, the Senate asked Yar'Adua to formally notify them of his absence so that his vice can take over as acting president. This was backed by calls from former heads of state, lawmakers, and the Nigerian Bar Association. Also, the opposition was not left out. But some ministers allegedly opposed placing Jonathan as the acting president while his principal was ill and out of the country. Even the Attorney General, Michael Aonduaka, said at a press conference that Yar'Adua could rule from anywhere in the world as long as he was not incapacitated. However, the Minister of Information, Dora Akunyili, opposed Aonduaka's views and argued that the president's prolonged absence was damaging the country's image and threatening the economy, while she urged her colleagues to do the right thing. Jonathan was powerless to give orders as two commanders-in-chief could not function at the same time. He deployed soldiers to restore order in Jos, Plateau State, where Muslims and Christians were clashing, killing hundreds. But this move was criticized by people who felt only the president was authorized to do such. The amnesty program initiated by Yar'Adua was also under threat of falling apart due to his absence, and militants were on the verge of resuming attacks on oil facilities. On December 19, 2009, the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta carried out their first attacks on an oil pipeline because of the delay in amnesty talks arising from Yar'Adua's absence. A lot of other scenarios played out across the country where the attention of the president was needed but unavailable, like the swearing in of a new Chief Justice, which could only be done by the president, and so many other cases where the government was helpless to do anything without authorization from their principal, that was incommunicado. There were demonstrations from the Save Nigeria group, Socio-Economic Rights and Accountability Project, and others demanding the empowerment of Jonathan as acting president. The country's polity was heated up and on the brink of collapse. After 7 weeks of silence, on January 12, 2010, President Yar'Adua spoke on a radio interview stating that he was recovering from his illness and would return home soon. This did nothing to ease tensions, as he had given the interview in Hausa language and not English, which was the country's official language. The calls for him to either resign or hand power over to his vice intensified. Using the purported Yar'Adua's interview as a handover note, the National Assembly adopted the Doctrine of Necessity and vested Vice President Goodluck Jonathan the powers to act as president on February 9, 2010. After more than 2 months of stagnation, acting President Goodluck Jonathan took over the reins of government, albeit temporarily, and chaired his first cabinet meeting. Interestingly, the acting president sat on Yar'Adua's chair at the meeting. Jonathan then went on to remove his adversary, Michael Aonduaka, as Attorney General and disbursed $2 billion from windfall oil savings to the 36 states and government agencies. On February 24, 2010, President Yar'Adua was smuggled into the country at 3 a.m. via the Nnamdi Azikiwe Airport in Abuja. The ailing president's handlers did this to check the burgeoning power of acting President Goodluck Jonathan. But Yar'Adua was still not well enough to rule as president. Unperturbed, Jonathan continued to lead the nation. He dissolved the cabinet and swore in 38 new ministers. He also signed the 2010 budget. Statements and counter-statements would erupt at the villa. There was now a power play between Yar'Adua and Jonathan's camps. This distraction would go on until President Umaru Musa Yar'Adua died on May 5, 2010. He was 58. With Yar'Adua dead, so did the storm at the presidential villa. The next day, May 6, 2010, Jonathan was sworn in by the Chief Justice of Nigeria as Commander-in-Chief of the Nigerian Armed Forces. The new president was now in charge. President Jonathan vowed to fight corruption and promised to push through electoral reforms and organize credible elections in 2011. As the new president, Jonathan replaced the heads of the military and security services, thereby consolidating his hold on power. In September, he made known his intention to contest and run for president in the 2011 elections. Jonathan's campaign was hinged on his rags-to-riches story of him not having shoes as a child. Portraying himself as one who would understand the suffering of the masses, he encouraged the citizens, saying that if he could make it, so could they. He promised a break from the old and retrogressive ways things were being done in the country with the slogan, "A breath of fresh air." This was amid strong opposition from people who felt he was going back on his word of serving for only one term, and others who felt he never merited the position he was given, and as such, had no real plan for the progress of the country. However, his aides argued that he had only completed the first term of his former boss, President Umaru Musa Yar'Adua, who had died whilst in office and was entitled to his own tenure. The election day came and Jonathan won, getting about 57% of all the votes against the 31% garnered by his major opponent, Muhammadu Buhari. While violence erupted in the north, the Southerners were jubilant. However, local and international observers judged the election as the fairest election the country had held since 1993. On May 28, 2011, President Goodluck Jonathan signed the Freedom of Information Bill into law. The FOI made public records and information more freely available, growing the economy, creating jobs, providing happiness to all Nigerians, improving electricity and the healthcare sector, and providing efficient and affordable transportation and education for every child were the focus of his administration. Jonathan started work in earnest by unveiling his transformation agenda, which sought to transform the country into one of the world's largest economies by the year 2020. Following up on his agenda, President Jonathan established 9 new federal universities and strengthened existing ones. The target was to have at least one federal university in each state of the nation. To improve literacy in the north, 125 Amaujiri schools were established across 13 northern states, and girl education programs were introduced with 27 special girls' schools in Adamawa, Akwa Ibom, Delta, Ebonyi, Ekiti, Nasarawa, Yobe, and Zamfara states. The Tertiary Education Trust Fund, TET Fund, was strengthened for capacity and infrastructure, and over 8 million library resources were given to basic and secondary schools across the Federation. It was at this time Nigeria was rated as the largest economy in Africa and the 23rd in the world by both the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, with a gross domestic product of $570 billion. The country also became the #1 destination in Africa for foreign investors. In addition, the nation's labor force was impacted by the transformation agenda. The National Youth Service Corps (NYSC) members saw an upward review of their monthly allowance from 9,700 naira to 19,800 naira. The minimum wage for civil servants was also increased to 18,900 naira per month. President Jonathan facilitated the country's space advancement by launching Nigeria's Sat-2 and Nigeria's Sat-X satellites to provide internet bandwidth and provide early warning to prevent natural disasters. The National Space Research and Development Agency developed an indigenous synthetic aperture radar satellite to support secure coastal areas of the Niger Delta, and map out solid mineral deposits. Transformation also affected the country's agricultural sector. Food imports were reduced by over 40% in 2013, with an output of over 45 million metric tons. In 2014, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations ranked Nigeria as the world's largest producer of cassava. 120 million naira grants were disbursed to 27 young farmers under the Youth Empowerment Agricultural Program, and in 2015, 26 billion naira was also disbursed for the Fadama Dry Season Farming Project by young farmers. The Bank of Industry also granted access to funds, grants, loans, and other assistance to the tune of 25 billion naira to farmers in a bid to boost rice production, which resulted in local rice production contributing 320 billion naira to the GDP of the country. Giving in to calls for national discourse, President Jonathan set up the Nigerian National Conference in 2014. It was headed by retired Chief Justice Idris Legbo Kutigi. Some recommendations made during the conference included the creation of state police and the drafting of state constitutions. However, Jonathan was unable to implement them before the end of his tenure. The transformation agenda also birthed the 35% affirmative action for women in politics. This led to more women being given top political positions. Notable among them is the first female Chief Justice of Nigeria, Mariam Aloma Mukhtar. Also worthy of note is the long dead and buried automobile industry in Nigeria, which was revived during the Jonathan administration. Nigeria's flagship indigenous automaker, Innocent Vehicle Manufacturing Company, began selling their first made-in-Nigeria cars. Peugeot, Nissan, and Hyundai also started assembling small cars, trucks, and buses. A multi-modal transport system was introduced, which led to improvement in maritime safety and security. Railways were restored and water transportation was enhanced. 3,000 kilometers of rail lines which had been abandoned for many years were revived across the country. Intercity train services were also opened up. Despite the recorded successes, President Jonathan was accused of running one of the most expensive governments in the world. Allocations for feeding, refreshments, and foreign trips were hugely budgeted for by his administration. President Jonathan created new ministries and split already merged ministries, bringing the total number of ministries to 42, with each ministry being supervised by 2 ministers, that is, a substantive minister and a minister of state. There is also a permanent secretary, directors, personal assistants, and special advisors. This action was contrary to the previous move made by former President Obasanjo when he reduced the number of ministries from 22 to 16 by merging some of them. Apart from the high cost of running the ministries, which led to high recurrent expenditure in the national budget, some of the ministers were accused of misappropriating funds. One notable example of such a minister was the former Minister of Aviation, Stella Odua, who the House of Representatives indicted for using 255 million naira to buy 2 armored BMW limousine cars for herself. Also, the Minister of Petroleum, Alison Madueke, was accused of spending 10 billion naira to purchase 2 private jets for her use. Another shortcoming of President Jonathan's administration was the frivolous budget allocation and budget padding that was being done. For example, in 2010, the budget reflected that 23 million naira would be used to maintain the presidential villa. 53 million naira was allocated for computer accessories at the villa, and 1.19 million naira was approved for a canteen and purchasing kitchen equipment for the State House. The next year, all these allocations were expanded with nothing to show for it. 1.19 million naira was increased to 489 million naira for the same kitchen equipment. Computer accessories were boosted to 325 million naira, and maintenance of the villa grew to 29 billion naira. In 2013, refreshments and meals had a budget of 327 million naira, and the purchase of foodstuff was increased to 406 million naira. The Vice President, Namadi Sambo, had his own allocation of 112 million naira for foodstuff, 123 million naira for refreshments, and 7 million naira for cooking gas. 72 million naira was also budgeted for fueling generators at the State House. The height of it all was a spending of 1 billion naira for President Jonathan's inauguration into office on May 29, 2011. It was a complete waste of money. Corruption was rife in the Jonathan administration, and the president was slow to act in terms of prosecuting corrupt officials. In fact, Jonathan granted a presidential pardon to his former boss after the disgraced governor snuck back into the country dressed as a woman and evaded money laundering charges. Another big failure in President Jonathan's duty as commander-in-chief was his inability to curb insecurity issues in the country. On April 14, 2014, 276 schoolgirls were abducted by the militant Islamic group known as Boko Haram from a government secondary boarding school in Chibok, a town in Borno State. This event shook the nation to its core. Some of the girls were able to escape, while others were released following campaigning efforts and government negotiations, but a lot more are still in captivity and yet to be accounted for, as 16 of the girls were reportedly killed. President Jonathan also failed to put an end to the perennial clashes between Fulani herdsmen and farmers in the north-central region of the country. In 2013, over 100 police officers and other security agents were killed in a fell swoop by the Umbatse militia. The perpetrators were never brought to the book. Kidnapping became rampant in Bayelsa, Edo, and Ondo states. Targets included politicians, their family members, and public officials. The country soon became one of the most dangerous places in the world to live in. Fuel scarcity was also a recurrent affair during Jonathan's time in office. Existing refineries never worked at optimum capacity, and no new refineries were built despite his promises of revamping existing refineries and building new ones. Reliance on imported fuel left the country at the mercy of oil marketers. 6 trillion naira was spent on fuel subsidies unnecessarily. Nigeria, which had once been debt-free, was now swamped with an external debt of $9.377 billion and a domestic debt of $47.653 billion. Soon enough, citizens began to grumble and complain about the government. His many promises during the campaigns were not being fulfilled. Even former President Olusegun Obasanjo, who was influential in Jonathan's rise to the presidency, wrote an open letter to the president condemning his administration. President Goodluck Jonathan had promised to work on the power sector, promising to do so within 4 years if he was voted in, but power dropped to less than 2,000 megawatts from the 3,000 megawatts that were operational when he assumed office. These failures would hurt the president in the re-election bid in 2015. The 2015 elections drew near and President Jonathan was getting set to run for a full second term in office. If he had won, he would have been the longest-serving civilian president in Nigerian history. However, the president lost and he left the political scene quietly. President Goodluck Jonathan was greeted with stiff opposition, as it was claimed that he had promised to only serve a term if he was chosen to represent the PDP in the 2011 elections, but Jonathan debunked such claims. Opposition parties took him to court, claiming that he had already served 2 terms and was not eligible to contest again. However, President Jonathan was cleared by an Abuja High Court, maintaining that going by the express provision of Section 137, subsection 1, Article B of the 1999 Constitution as amended, the president was eligible to contest for the 2015 presidential election. The court, presided by Justice Mudashiru Oniyongi, held that the president had only served his first term in office when he was sworn in on May 29, 2011, after winning the election, saying he only completed Yar'Adua's tenure following his death and it was not viewed as a term in office. The 2015 general elections were held on March 28 and 29, 2015. Unfortunately, Jonathan's good luck charm failed him. He lost to the former head of state, retired General Muhammadu Buhari, who had 2.5 million votes more than him. With defeat staring at him in the face, President Jonathan did the unprecedented by congratulating his opponent on his victory even before the results were officially announced. 2 months later, the North returned to the seat of power with the swearing-in of Muhammadu Buhari as Nigeria's 5th executive president on May 29, 2015. You can know more about the Buhari presidency in our next episode.